Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112 for, believe it or not, our final class. And today is December 16th, Thursday, where we are finishing up with our poetry unit. And I left you last class with the request to listen to Allen Ginsberg read a draft of his poem, America. We had talked about how he's part of the movement that's known as beat poetry, where the poems are very defiant and unconventional. There's a stream of consciousness element to the poetry. It's deliberately unclear, and there are many topical references. And I think you could see that in the version that we saw. And I also gave you a link for America as well. If we were meeting in person, I would have given you a handout. This idea of I can't stand my own mind, which is in the third line. This issue of sanity and insanity, what is sane, what is insane. Ginsberg also was in and out of mental institutions, so there is also this semi-autobiographical sense. I've given you all is the first line, and now I'm nothing. The idea of how much can you give to your country, and does your country still require more where there's nothing left to give? And then that reference in the second line, $2.27. We don't know necessarily if that's what he has in his bank account or in his pocket, whether or not that's what he's saying he's valued by America as, or this is what he thinks America is valued as. Again, some of the references, because they are so stream of consciousness, are very personal. When will we end the human war? There definitely is this sense throughout the poetry about how governments basically fund war rather than trying to work on social ills. Go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. That's a quote. So definitely we can see the sense of profanity there. Atom bombs are also very phallic. So there is that element of sexuality as well. I don't feel good, don't bother me. Again, this idea of sanity and insanity. I won't write my poem till I'm in my right mind. So the idea is that he must be in his right mind because he's written the poem. When will you be angelic, America, and take off your clothes? In other words, when will you show the truth to the world? When will you look at yourself through the grave? In other words, when will you consider all of the people who have lost their lives senselessly, at least from Ginsberg's perspective, in order to defend the country? And then asking questions that, again, are related to communism. He was very openly a supporter of communism. And also the idea of why your library is full of tears, the idea that our history is based on sadness. When will you send your eggs to India? When will we start caring for other countries? I'm sick of your insane demands. Notice how this poem goes back and forth between him being insane, America being insane, maybe both being insane at the same time. When can I go to the supermarket? This is line 15, and buy what I need with my good looks. The idea so much of America is superficial, and that basically appearance allows individuals to have privilege in our society. Your machinery is too much for me. There's definitely a reference to the mechanization of society and the loss of humanity because of the mechanization of society. I suspect if he was writing his poetry now, he would talk about the internet and technology. He makes references to individuals in the news, for instance, industrial workers, a labor organization. And he also talks a little bit about, or actually, he asks, there are many questions in this poem, oftentimes without answers. The idea of, are you being sinister, or is this some form of practical joke? And I'm trying to come to the point, and of course that's ridiculous that he says that because there's just this long rambling in this poem. I refuse to give up my obsession. I know what I'm doing. I haven't read the newspapers for months. Every day somebody goes on trial for murder, and certainly lots of current individuals or lots of contemporary individuals have said the same thing about wanting to avoid the news because it's so negative. I feel sentimental about the Wobblies. They're the industrial workers. I used to be a communist when I'm a kid. I'm not sorry. I smoke marijuana every chance I get. Ginsberg was known for basically smoking marijuana and indulging in other substances. Keep in mind, marijuana was illegal at the time. When he says he sits for hours on end in his closet and he stares at the roses in the closet, one wonders if he means that literally because he's high and he's just looking at wallpaper that has roses. The idea that, too, Ginsburg was openly homosexual, and if he's talking about being in the closet and getting out of the closet, perhaps there's a reference there. I go to Chinatown. I get drunk and never get laid. You should have seen me reading Marx. Marx, of course, the Communist Manifesto. My psychoanalyst thinks I'm perfectly right. The irony there about, his therapist thinks that he's fine. I won't say the Lord's Prayer. So this poem questions things like government. This poem questions things like authority. This poem questions things like religion. And when he says I have mystical visions and cosmic vibrations, I think he means that quite literally because of his drug use. I didn't tell you what they did to Uncle Max after he came home from Russia. And again, what happens to our soldiers when they return back. Think about Soldiers Home in Ernest Hemingway. And then perhaps one of the more important lines in the poem, I'm addressing you. In other words, Ginsburg is challenging us as representatives of America, asking, is this true? Is this right? We don't have to necessarily agree with him. In fact, we might vehemently disagree. The question is, if we vehemently disagree, why do we disagree? What is our evidence? And then he goes on and says, will you let your emotional life be run by Time magazine? The influence of the media. Again, if we were in contemporary times, I think he'd ask, will you let your emotional life be run by Twitter, for instance? I'm obsessed by Time magazine. Its cover stares at me. I read it in the basement of the Berkeley Public Library. And then I did talk about the beat poets coming out of Berkeley. In fact, Ginsburg taught at UC Berkeley. So literally, he would be in the Berkeley Public Library. It's always telling me about responsibility, that businessmen are serious, movie producers are serious, everybody's serious but me. And it occurs to me that I am America. So at this point, perhaps he's acknowledging that he's part of the problem. I'm talking to myself again. The question of, is anybody listening? Now, I know that this poem sounds very serious. The draft that he read was much more comical. I think part of that was because of his audience. Obviously, he had a very supportive audience who was listening to him. So I think he was able to take that particular risk. Asia is rising against me, and basically he's talking about the fear of other nations taking over American superiority, or the assumption of American superiority. I better consider my national resources. I haven't got a Chinaman's chance. Notice how he uses things like puns. My national resources consists of 2 joints of marijuana, millions of genitals, and unpublished literature that goes 1,400 miles an hour, 25,000 mental institutions. And again, notice how the poetry is beginning to look like prose at this point with a series of run-ons. I say nothing about my prisons nor the millions of underprivileged who live in my flower pots under the light of 500 suns. And one wonders if, again, he's talking about growing marijuana at this point. I have abolished the whorehouses of France, Tangiers. Tangiers is the next to go. My ambition is to be president, despite the fact that I'm Catholic. And again, this would have been quite controversial if you think about the idea that Kennedy was the first Catholic president, Biden being our second. America, how can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? The idea that this poem is disjointed and ugly and nonsensical because America is disjointed, ugly, and nonsensical. I will continue like Henry Ford. My strophes are as individual as his automobiles. And if you think about Henry Ford and the idea of the assembly line, which he helped to create, the industrialization of America, and also the idea of a strophe is an element in Greek drama where all the members of the chorus are doing exactly the same thing, which is very similar to what would happen in an assembly line. Everybody is doing exactly the same thing. Free Tom Mooney and the Spanish loyalists, and Sacco and Vanzetti must not die. Again, he's making references to individuals in the news who, from his perspective, have experienced some kind of injustice. America, I am the Scottsboro Boys. He continues on. And then we end up again with the poem collapsing into something that looks like prose and run-on sentences. America, when I was 7, Mama took me to a communist cell meeting. They sold us garbanzos, a handful per ticket. A ticket cost a nickel, and the speeches were free. Everybody was angelic and sentimental about the workers. It was also sincere. You have no idea what a good thing the party was in 1935. Scott Neary was a grand old man, a real mensch. Mother Bloor made me cry. I once saw Israel Amter Everybody must have been a spy. And again, the idea, some of the paranoia that was existing in the 1950s. America, you don't really want to go to war. It's them bad Russians, those Russians, the Chinamen, and then Russia. And again, the idea that other powers are seen as the enemy. The Russia wants to eat us alive. The Russia's power man. And notice how he's beginning to mimic the speech patterns of English as a second language or English as foreign language speakers. She wants to take our cars from out of our garages. And this was, of course, the beginning of the superiority of the automobile. We've, of course, seen the environmental consequences of that in our own time period. Her wants to grab Chicago. Her needs a red Reader's Digest. Her wants auto plants in Siberia. Him big bureaucracy running our filling stations. That no good. Him make Indians learn read. Him need big black niggers. Think about what I just said. And think about the power of using that kind of racial slur. And again, Ginsburg is not for everyone. I've noticed that basically people either love Ginsburg for unveiling the ugly truth, or people hate Ginsburg for not being supportive of a society that offers him privilege and opportunity. And perhaps you can feel a little bit of both in some respects. Her make us all work 16 hours a day. Help. This is quite serious. And of course, this is rather ironic in the way that he read that. This is the impression I get from looking in the television set. Again, how the media has basically created much of the problems that he is detailing. Is this correct? Again, challenging us. Is this true? I'd better get right down to the job. It's true, I don't want to join the army or turn lathes in precision parts factories. I'm nearsighted, psychopathic anyway. America, I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel. When he makes reference to queer, he means that quite literally because, again, he's talking about sexual orientation. So, Ginsburg, again, is a really great example, I think, of the poem America, where we were talking about poetry trying to challenge and break boundaries and expectations. Now, the next poem I wanted to talk about is on page 797 in our text, but I've also given the link, The Lover Not Taken. And I'm hopeful that that title sounds familiar to you because we read a poem called The Road Not Taken. And certainly you can enjoy The Lover Not Taken without, and understand it without knowing The Road Not Taken, but it takes on such a depth of meaning when you understand that this poem is a parody of Frost's The Road Not Taken. And a parody is something that's mimicked and exaggerated for humorous effect. Think Saturday Night Live, if you will. And this time, what we've got, Blanche Farley, a female author, who is supplying us, as opposed to Frost, a male author, who is supplying us with a specific set of choices, unlike Frost, who kept things very, very general. And this poem deliberately defies conventions. It was written in 1984, and the 1980s were oftentimes known as the decade of decadence. And I think perhaps you can see some of that in this particular poem. And we have a slightly ambiguous ending, but I wanted to read this poem to you. Again, it's on page 797. And you can see that she's taken directly some of the language from Frost's poem so that you can see that it's being parodied. Committed to one, she wanted both. And mulling it over, long she stood, alone on the road, loath to leave, wanting to hide in the undergrowth. This new guy, smooth as a yellow wood, really turned her on. She liked his hair, his smile. But the other, Jack, had a claim on her already, and she had to admit he did wear well. In fact, to be perfectly fair, he understood her. His long, lithe frame beside hers in the evening tenderly lay. Still, if the blonde guy dropped by some day, Couldn't Wei just lead on to Wei? No, for if Wei led on and Jack found out, she doubted if he would ever come back. Oh, she turned with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence she might be telling this, and I, she would say, stood faithfully by. But by then, who would know the difference? With that in mind, she took the fast way home, the road by the pond, and phoned the blonde. And of course, there's some humor in this particular poem, as we would expect with the parody. The idea that her choice is about two different relationships. She's in a committed relationship with one, and that individual gets a name, Jack, and then she's in a non-committed relationship with the other who doesn't get a name, and she's considering an affair. And we definitely know what she's expected to do, especially as a female in society. She's expected to stay in her committed relationship. But we see that as she contemplates this new guy, smooth as a yellow wood, really turned her on. And the idea is that he's blonde, but think about how wood is oftentimes used as a euphemism for erection. So there's a sexual component in this. She liked his hair, his smile, but the other, Jack, this is the committed relationship, had a cling. And he did wear well. In other words, he's comfortable. He understood her. And obviously they have a relationship because they lie together at night. Still, if the blonde guy dropped by, couldn't Wei just lead on to Wei? And the question is no. And not necessarily because it's wrong, but if Jack found out, she doubted he would ever come back, that she'd lose one relationship if she started the other. Oh, she turned with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence she might be telling this, and I stood faithfully by. But by then, who would know the difference? In other words, is this decision really as important as she's making it out to be? It's important to her and certainly to the parties involved, but in the scheme of the universe, how important is any decision that any of us make about our personal lives? And then the very last two lines. With that in mind, she took the fast way home, the road by the pond, and phoned the blonde. And we assume that she took the fast way home. That suggests that she's taking the easy way out and that she is going to have that relationship. But again, notice the title. It's The Lover Not Taken. We don't know what she tells Jack when she phones him. She might end up saying something else. And is having the relationship really the easy way, or is not having the relationship really the easy way? So that's an interesting element of ambiguity there. But I wanted you to see this poem because I wanted to introduce you to the idea of a parody. And then the poem that I wanted us to shift to, and this is another poem that I would have distributed on a handout, but I've included a link to it. Coca-Cola and Coco Frio by Martin Espada. Now, Martin Espada is actually a professor at UMass Amherst, which I think is kind of cool because if you go to UMass Amherst, you would have the opportunity to take a class with him and speak to him about his poetry. He actually began as an attorney trying to defend civil rights, and he wrote poetry in his spare time. His poetry became so popular and so significant that he basically shifted roles, and now he is a full-time professor and poet, and he practices law basically on a pro bono level. And one of the things that he talks about in this particular poem is the idea of the difference between the United States and Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico is in a very interesting place politically because it's technically not a state of the United States. So it is not technically part of the United States. It is a territory. But that means that it is part of the United States, and Puerto Ricans are basically citizens of the United States, even though they have different cultural traditions, though you could say that might be the case of every state. And they also have different language. Spanish is the primary language, and then English is the secondary language. Now, you could perhaps think of something like Hawaii. And there's a lot of political back and forth about whether or not Puerto Rico should be made a state, or whether or not Puerto Rico should be made independent, or whether it should retain the status that it has. There are business reasons for its current status, that there are tax breaks for large corporations because it's classified as a territory rather than classified as a state. So as most things political, it's rather complex. And many Puerto Ricans emigrate to the United States, and certainly did emigrate to the United States, and emigrated to New York City, which happens to be the story of my own family. So while I was born in New York City, my parents were born in Puerto Rico, and when they were young children, they were brought by their parents to New York City. So this particular poem, Martin Espada admits, is somewhat autobiographical, that the fat boy in the poem is himself, but it also is symbolic. And it's a poem about assimilation. And I wanted to read this poem to you and talk a little bit about the rhythms of the poem, because even though it's written in English, it has a very lyrical sense to it, much like the Romance languages, including Spanish. And that's done very deliberately because Martin Espada is bilingual. And I had the pleasure of hearing him read this poem live, actually, at GCC. And he does give it a rather lyrical sense when he reads it. Something that we'll see with our last poem as well. But let me get through Coca-Cola and Coco Frio first by Martin Espada, 1993. On his first visit to Puerto Rico, island of family folklore, the fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open. At every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool, spotted hands to a glass of Coca-Cola. One even sang to him, in all the English she could remember, a Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. He drank obediently, though he was bored with this potion, familiar from soda fountains in Brooklyn. Then, at a roadside stand off the beach, the fat boy opened his mouth to Coco Frio, a coconut chilled, then scalped by a machete, so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. The boy tilted the green shell overhead and drooled coconut milk down his chin. Suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. For years afterward, the boy marveled at an island where the people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak, while so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. And of course, if you know Puerto Rico, it's an island, but so is Manhattan, and so is New York, even though we don't think of it that way. And Puerto Rico means rich port. In other words, that it is a place with a lot of natural resources. And he talks about his first visit, that basically he's going to Puerto Rico as a tourist, even though he is Puerto Rican. The island of family folklore, so this is where his relatives originated. The fat boy, which he talks about himself, but could also represent America or an American that we tend to overconsume. The fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open. The assumption is that there's a hunger there of wanting something. At every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool, spotted hands. And the hands are spotted because we're talking about the older generation. Again, the heritage that from which he comes from. 2 glasses of Coca-Cola, and perhaps there's nothing else that represents America as much as Coca-Cola. And if you think about what Coca-Cola is, it's basically sweetened water and syrup. And the origins of Coca-Cola, it actually had a little bit of cocaine in it. It's, as I'm sure you're well aware, incredibly profitable and a popular beverage. It also is unhealthy, and oftentimes it's readily available, and even more so than clean water in some areas, which leads to a whole host of difficulties in terms of health and welfare. And as we talk about Coca-Cola, it basically is at this point global. It's across the planet, and it represents America. One even sang to him in all the English she could remember, Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. And again, the assumption of the reach of the advertising and media into Puerto Rico and from the United States. And also this idea that individuals are learning snippets of English that basically are based on jingles that will help profit corporate America. He drank obediently, though he was bored with the potion. familiar with from soda fountains in Brooklyn. Remember, he was raised in New York City, so he's quite familiar with this. Then at a roadside stand off the beach. In other words, that now he's getting to the true riches of Puerto Rico, the rural areas. The fat boy opened his mouth to Coco Frio. So this is another beverage, not as well known as Coca-Cola, but this beverage represents Puerto Rico. It's a coconut chilled, then scalped by a machete, so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. And it's the exact opposite of Coca-Cola. It isn't something that's corporate. It's something that's local. It's something that's healthy. It's something that is natural. And the reference to milk is supposed to bring forth images of the idea of a child suckling. The idea is that this fat boy is looking for his motherland, his heritage, so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. The boy tilted the green shell overhead, and the shell is green because this is fresh. It's not like the kind of coconut that you would have shipped to you into a supermarket. The boy tilted the green shell and drooled coconut milk down his chin. Again, that's how hungry he is for his culture. And think about, too, how coconuts can represent breasts if we're talking about suckling and milk. Suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. That this was an epiphany for him because he was able to experience the natural beauty of Puerto Rico. And for years afterwards, the boy marveled at an island where the people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak. In other words, the assimilation that's occurred in Puerto Rico. And also, I think that's something that's very common, that we tend to want that which is not readily available. So since we want perhaps pineapples is the example I give in the United States because they aren't readily available. In New England, what is readily available is apples, but they seem rather common and ordinary. I suspect that if we were to talk to Hawaii, they might actually feel that apples were much more desirable because pineapples are very prevalent. And in this idea, or he wonders why it is that there are coconuts everywhere, but people don't want the coconuts, the natural bounty that surrounds them. They want Coca-Cola. In a language they did not speak well, so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. There's that breast imagery again, that people aren't taking advantage of their local heritage. So the very last poem that I wanted to give to you, and the last poem is going to be our attendance question, is entitled The Hill We Climb. This was read by the poet herself, Amanda Gorman, youngest inaugural poet at the presidential inauguration, 21 years old, at President Biden's 2021 swearing in. And sometimes poetry, I think, is just best to be heard and appreciated and not necessarily to be analyzed, particularly since this poem is so contemporary and is so raw when you think about the January 6th uprising that occurred. So I wanted you basically just to hear her deliver this poem. You can see she does it in a very musical way. I've given you the link for you to listen to this poem. And I really didn't want to say anything about this poem. I think it stands on its own, and I think its beauty doesn't necessarily need any kind of explication from me. That said, I thought for today's attendance question that I could ask you to respond to this particular poem. That if you were teaching this poem, The Hill We Climb, what is one point you would make about this particular poem and why? So I suspect that after all of you have answered this attendance question, what you'll have is a good explication of the poem. But again, I didn't really want to do anything with this poem outside of have you listened to it? And I can tell you that my reaction when I first heard this poem is that, and actually I had posted this on social media, I've seen the future of poetry, and her name is Amanda Gorman. It literally sent chills up and down my spine, and it still does, even though I've heard it many, many times. So I wanted to end by just reminding you about the assignments. Paper number 2 is due today, the 16th, if you're watching this on Thursday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. As you usually do, this will be your drama paper. And the final exam, based on the time in which we were given by the college, if we were meeting in person, would be December 20th, which is a Monday at 3:30 p.m. So that will be the time in which I post our final. If we were meeting in person, we would have 2 hours for this final exam. Because we're not meeting in person, I'm going to give you 24 hours for this final exam. So it will be due on the 21st, which is Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. I don't expect it to be as neat or polished or well developed as anything that you would do for a paper or even for a journal. Just again, the idea is that you're able to synthesize things. Our last journal actually will be due on Friday. As well, so that I have hopefully an opportunity over the weekend to review those journals for you and get them back to you before you take the final exam so that you can reference those journals. Because ultimately, the final exam, 80% of it will be based on poetry. What I'm going to be doing is basically selecting a handful of poems and asking you to respond to 2 poems. Though there'll be a 10-point question about short story, 10-point question about drama, and there'll be choice within there. It's open book, open notes. You can use the resources like our text and your journals and discussion forum questions and things of that nature. So I believe the last thing to do is just for me to thank you. I understand how challenging these times are and how challenging they've been. And I have great admiration and respect for all of you that despite all of these challenges and unknowns, you've had the energy and the stamina and the fortitude to make it this far in this semester. And just hang on a little bit longer. We're almost towards the end. And I hope we get to meet soon. But at any rate, again, I wanted to thank you. And for one last time, say that I'm doing well and I hope you're doing well. And I will post the final on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.